Welcome to Parliament House. In a moment, we'll hear the Leader of the Opposition give his reply to the federal budget in the House of Representatives. On Tuesday, Treasurer Jim Chalmers delivered the Albanese government's third budget, producing a second surplus and setting out an agenda to support new industries to drive the energy transition. It's also the opposition leader's third budget in reply, which means there are growing calls for more details of the coalition's plans as an alternative government. Peter Dutton will join me after the speech, which is about to begin.
Honourable members, the Speaker.
I give the call to the Honourable the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Tonight I want to outline part of my vision for Australia to get our country back on track, to keep our nation safe and secure, to make life easier and better for all Australians, because this Labor government has made life so much tougher for Australians, because this Labor government has set our country on a very dangerous course. Almost 2 years ago, Prime Minister Albanese was elected promising a reduction of $275 each year in your power prices, cheaper mortgages, and that you would be better off under a Labor government. All of those promises have been broken. And this government has been focused on the wrong priorities. It started with the Prime Minister's Voice referendum. Not only did it waste $450 million, which could have helped families with the cost of living pressures that you're now facing, the referendum also divided our nation. And let's not forget that the Prime Minister called no voters chicken littles and doomsayers. Today, millions of Australians are struggling to pay their bills. Even going to the supermarket and petrol station has become stressful for so many. Prime Minister, Australians are genuinely hurting under your government, and they're not chicken littles. Electricity bills haven't gone down by $275, as was pledged on 97 occasions. They've skyrocketed. The Treasurer will give you a $300 rebate, but he knows full well that your annual electricity bills have increased, in some cases by up to $1,000 since Labor formed government. Interest rates have gone up on 12 occasions under Labor, and a typical Australian household with a mortgage is $35,000 worse off. And that's if you're lucky enough to own a home. Under this Prime Minister, the great Australian dream of home ownership has turned into a nightmare. Even finding somewhere to rent is near impossible. Now, the government has brought in an additional 923,000 migrants in just 2 years. On the available data, the government has only contributed 265,000 new homes and units to accommodate those people. And then, of course, there's Labor's tax on the family car and ute. You're having to fork out literally thousands of dollars more simply for choosing some of Australia's most popular vehicles, like a Toyota RAV4, including the hybrid, or the Ford Ranger, all because the government is trying to force you into buy an electric vehicle. And if you want to buy an electric vehicle, that is your choice. But if you choose to buy a vehicle that is not a hybrid or is not a diesel, that is your choice, and it should be restored. Now, all of this has happened in a very quick period of time, in just 2 years. Paul Keating famously said that when governments change, the country changes. Prime Minister Albanese and his government have changed our country, but as so many Australians can attest to, not for the better. You, your family, your children and our country can't afford another 3 years of this government. I know how to make decisions to get our country back on track. And tonight I will remind Australians of the Coalition's economic plan to lower your cost of living and restore confidence to our economy. I will also outline several policies which Australians can expect from a Coalition government under my leadership. Policies to get power bills down and to shore up our nation's future energy security. Policies to help alleviate our housing crisis and revive the great Australian dream of home ownership. Policies to improve workforce participation and health services, and policies to make our communities, our society and our country better and safer. But first, Mr Speaker, I'll respond to the Treasurer's budget from Tuesday night. As I've said previously, we're an opposition which supports good policy and stands against bad policy. Since Labor formed government, we've backed more than 180 bills which have passed this parliament. But we've opposed some bills where Labor and the Greens have collaborated to pass legislation which is not in our country's best interests. Just as we endorsed some sensible measures in Labor's first two budgets, we do the same for its third budget. In particular, the $3.4 billion for medicines on the Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme and the extension of emergency payments to support women and children fleeing domestic violence, which the Coalition first established in 2021. In my 22 years in Parliament, I've seen good and bad budgets, but the budget handed down on Tuesday night is one of the most irresponsible I've seen. Inflation is a huge problem for Australia. On comparative inflation, Australia is worse than the US, Singapore, Germany, Spain, Japan, the Netherlands, Italy, South Korea, Canada, France and the entire euro area. The reason interest rates have gone up 12 times is because the government can't control its spending and because of its reckless energy policy. In 3 Labor budgets, the government has lifted spending by a staggering $315 billion, or $30,000 per Australian household. The Reserve Bank Governor has sounded the alarm on inflation being homegrown, and she's exactly right. In the last 48 hours, every credible economist has issued scathing assessments of this budget because Labor has us in an inflationary hole and is still digging. And make no mistake, any further interest rate increases that fuel inflation now will continue also to rest squarely on the shoulders of this Prime Minister and Treasurer. Magic pudding spending and $13.7 billion on corporate welfare for billionaires doesn't help the economy or make your life easier. Let's also be clear about Labor's $300 energy rebate, which will cost the economy $3.5 billion. We will support this relief because we know Australians are hurting. But the government is treating the symptom, not the disease. Labor's renewable-only policy is the reason your power bills continue to skyrocket. Here's some facts which show the troubling state of our economy. More than 16,000 businesses around the country have gone insolvent since the 1st of July 2022. Behind each of those is a family who may have lost their home but certainly have lost their savings. Productivity has plunged by 5.4% on this government's watch, and household buying power has gone down by 7.5%, which you feel every time you go to the supermarket. Last year, Australians suffered the biggest increase in average tax rates of any citizens in the developed world. There's been double-digit increases for your essentials like electricity, gas, milk, bread and rent. And tragically, so many more Australians are living in cars and tents. And because of spending in this budget, the economic outlook is one of deficits as far as the eye can see. To alleviate cost of living pressures, we need to get inflation down. To get our economy back on track, we need a back-to-basics economic plan. And that's what a coalition government will deliver. First, we will rein in inflationary spending to take the pressure off inflation. As a start, we will not spend $13.7 billion on corporate welfare for green hydrogen and critical minerals. These projects should stand up on their own without the need for taxpayers' money if they're worth the investment. Second, we will wind back Labor's intervention and remove regulatory roadblocks which are suffocating the economy and stopping businesses from getting ahead. For example, we will not force large firms to spend more than $1 billion a year policing the emissions of every small business they deal with, as Labor is trying to do. We will condense approval processes and cut back on Labor's red tape, which is killing mining, jobs and entrepreneurialism. Only yesterday, Santos indicated it will have to let 200 employees go because of slow project approvals. I want mining to boom in Western Australia and around the nation. More mining means more revenue. More revenue means more roads and less congestion, more schools and more hospitals. A turbocharged West Australian economy means more national prosperity. And we don't need to give out billions of dollars of taxpayers' money to get mining projects started. Third, we will remove the complexity and hostility of Labor's industrial relations agenda, which is putting unreasonable burdens on businesses. For example, we'll revert to the former coalition government's simple definition of a casual worker and create certainty for our 2.5 million small businesses. Fourth, we will provide lower, simpler and fairer taxes for all, because Australians should keep more of what they earn. And you'll hear more about our tax plan ahead of the election. Fifth, we'll deliver competition policy which gives consumers and small businesses a fair go, not lobbyists and big corporations. And sixth, we will ensure Australians have more affordable and reliable energy. Mr Speaker, our economic plan, with its tried and tested principles, will restore competitiveness and rebuild economic confidence. Small businesses are the lifeblood of our communities. I've run a small business, as many of my colleagues have. Unlike most Labor parliamentarians, the Coalition understands small businesses. Tonight, I announce that we will extend the value of assets eligible for the instant asset write-off to $30,000 and make this ongoing for small businesses. This will simplify depreciation for millions of small businesses by cutting red tape, boosting investment in productive assets, lowering business costs and prices, and driving productivity in the economy. Mr Speaker, a respected senior journalist recently wrote that energy is not part of the economy, it is the economy. And the government's renewables-only policy continues to drive up power prices. Electricity and gas prices have gone up 18% and 25% respectively under this government. You can see this rise in your household power bills. But the energy bills of farmers, of businesses and manufacturers have also skyrocketed. And that means the cost to make anything from food to furniture has also gone up. And that's why you're paying more at the supermarket and at the shops. If energy is not affordable or reliable, more manufacturers will simply shut up shop, they'll move offshore, we lose the jobs and the economic productivity, and we'll just re-import the products at a higher price. That's Labor's formula at the moment. And that's why there's been a threefold increase in the number of manufacturers who have closed their doors over the last 2 years. And for all of the government's talk about a future made in Australia, their current approach has no chance if energy isn't cheap and consistent and comparable to other competitive nations. Renewables have a role to play in our energy system, of course they do, but we can't rely on weather-dependent energy alone. We need power 24/7, especially for our hospitals, for our factories and freezers that need to operate around the clock. Now, concerningly, the government's renewables-only policy will see 90% of that 24/7 power switched off over the next decade. So it's a fair question to ask, how are things progressing for the government's plan for 5 gigawatts of renewables per year? Well, last year, 1.3 gigawatts were committed, almost 75% off target. Another Chris Bowen special. Rewiring our country will cost at least $1.3 trillion. Now, who will bear that cost? It will be you and your family, it will be farmers, it will be manufacturers, and it will be other businesses. So if you think you're paying higher prices for power today, they will only get much higher under a renewables-only rollout under this government. Our nation has 3 energy goals: cheaper power, consistent power and cleaner power. And we won't achieve these goals under Labor's renewables-only policy. But we can achieve all 3. And we can do that by showing the leadership and following the top 20 economies of the world, which are using zero-emission nuclear power or are taking steps to put it into the mix. Australia is the only one of the top 20 economies in the world not to do so. And by ramping up domestic gas production for affordable and reliable energy in the more immediate term, we can help keep the lights on and push power prices down. After 2 years of interventions into the gas market, skyrocketing prices and repeated warnings of shortfalls, Labor's new gas strategy is just words on paper. There's little chance of Labor bringing new gas supply into the system because it's ideologically opposed to gas and it's more worried about winning votes from the Greens in inner-city seats than it is worried about people living in suburbs or in regional towns around the country. Unlike Labor, a coalition government will speed up approvals, unlock gas in key basins like the Beetaloo, defund the Environmental Defenders Office, which is halting vital projects through lawfare, ensure gas is delivered to where it's needed by reinstating the National Gas Infrastructure Plan, and commit to an annual release of offshore acreage for exploration and development in the Northern Territory and Western Australia. On nuclear power, some 50 countries are exploring or investing into zero-emission, next-generation technologies for the very first time. We hold the largest deposits of uranium on the planet. You have to ask yourself the question, does the Prime Minister and Minister Chris Bowen have it right, or is the rest of the developed world just doesn't know what they're talking about? I mean, ask yourself that question. Would you side with Anthony Albanese and Chris Bowen or the rest of the developed world? It's a fair question and I think most Australians know the answer to it. The government have ordered nuclear-powered submarines, so it raises a reasonable question. Why is the technology safe for our submariners but unsafe for our citizens? Because of nuclear power, residents in Ontario, Canada pay up to a quarter of the cost of what some Australians pay for electricity. With nuclear power, we can maximise the highest yield of energy per square metre and minimise our environmental damage. We do that by putting new nuclear technologies on or near the brownfield sites of decommissioned or retiring coal-fired power plants using the existing grid. There's no need for all of the proposed 58 million solar panels, almost 3,500 wind farms and 28,000 kilometres of new transmission poles and wires. Bob Hawke was a strong Labor leader who strongly supported nuclear power, as does John Howard, along with the Australian Workers' Union and many others who have a vision for the future of our country, including some 65% of Australians aged 18 to 34 years of age. Making Australia a nuclear-powered nation is right for our country and will secure a future of cheaper, consistent and cleaner electricity. We need the right policy for you and for our nation. Mr Speaker, beyond Labor's energy crisis, we're also facing a Labor-created housing crisis. The great Australian aspiration of home ownership has become out of reach for so many. Now, it's wonderful that parents, in some circumstances with financial means, can help their kids into a home. But I will never accept a situation where the only people who can afford to buy a home in our country are those with the support of their parents. The Coalition has already committed, and we tonight recommit, to allowing Australians to access up to $50,000 of their super to buy their first home, and extended this policy to separated women to help restart their lives. The money initially withdrawn from super will need to be returned when the house is sold to support retirement, and in most cases it will be with an uplift that will see retirement even more secure. But there's more that we need to do. For almost 20 years I've chaired my local Salvation Army Red Shield appeal. 2 weeks ago at our annual fundraising breakfast I heard a heartbreaking account of a man in his 70s having to live in his car. It is such a soul-destroying experience. It's sad, but it is not an uncommon story, and it's one that I've heard at Food Bank and at many places around our great country. Australians are struggling to find homes to rent and buy, and it's not always due to a lack of money. Amidst this housing crisis, Labor is bringing in 1.67 million migrants over 5 years, more than the population of Adelaide, in 5 years. We celebrate the contributions of migrants over many decades. We're a great country because of what they've helped to build, and the great Australian achievement of modern Australia is something that we celebrate every day. But by getting the migration policy settings right, the Coalition can free up more houses for Australians. Now, the Prime Minister has promised to build 1.2 million homes by 2029, but on the government's current trajectory, they will fall short by 400,000 homes or 33%. The Prime Minister is making the housing crisis much, much worse, and Australians need homes now. We're at an 11-year low of building approvals. To help Australians into homes, we need to make sure that we prioritise them for existing homes, the homes that have already been built. The other impact Australians are feeling from the Albanese government's poor management of the migration program is from congestion on our roads and pressure on our existing services, which are stretched, like trying to get in to see a GP. Tonight I announced several measures a coalition government will implement to meet our housing crisis head-on by alleviating pressure on the housing market. We believe that by rebalancing the migration program and taking decisive action on the housing crisis, the coalition can free up almost 40,000 additional homes in the first year and well over 100,000 homes in the first 5 years. First, we will implement a 2-year ban on foreign investors and temporary residents purchasing existing homes in Australia. Yeah. Secondly, we will reduce the permanent migration program by 25% from 185,000 to 140,000 for the first 2 years in recognition of the urgency of the crisis. The program will then increase to 150,000 in Year 3 and 160,000 in Year 4. We will ensure there are enough skilled and temporary skilled visas for those with building and construction skills to support our local tradies to build the homes and the units that we need across the country. Similarly, we will return the refugee and humanitarian program planning. The humanitarian program will remain one of the most generous in the world on a per capita basis. Third, we will reduce excessive numbers of foreign students studying at metropolitan universities to relieve stress on rental markets in our major cities. We will work with universities to put in place a cap on foreign students, and we will enhance the integrity of the student visa program by introducing a tiered approach to increasing the student visa application fee and applying it to foreign students who change providers. Now, the usual CEOs and some of the big businesses may not like this approach, but my priority is to restoring the great Australian home ownership dream. Yeah. Mr Speaker, while reducing migration numbers to ease pressure on housing, the coalition government will encourage thousands of people to engage more in the labour market. We recommit to increasing the amount that older Australians and veterans can work without reducing pension payments if they choose to do so, if it's right for them. We will double the existing work bonus, $300 per fortnight to $600. It's estimated that this will benefit over 80,000 pensioners and veterans who choose to work. We'll look to further expand the work bonus arrangements beyond this commitment in consultation with older Australians and veterans and in consideration of labour market conditions prevailing at the time. Pensioners will continue to accrue unused pension work bonus amounts up to a maximum of $11,800, which can exempt future earnings from the pension income test. We'll also lift the number of hours that those on student visas can work by 12 hours a fortnight. Mr Speaker, amidst our cost of living crisis created by Labor, people's health and wellbeing are suffering. That's why we committed to restoring the number of Medicare subsidised psychological sessions from 10 to 20 and on a permanent basis. As Health Minister, I increased hospital funding year on year. I also established the $20 billion Medical Research Future Fund, which to this day provides billions of dollars to medical research projects. Indeed, when I became Health Minister in 2013, we inherited a bulk billing rate from Labor of 73% and increased it to 84%. When we left government, bulk billing was 88.5%. What Labor tried to hide in its budget, and a figure that wasn't mentioned by the Treasurer, is that bulk billing has decreased under Labor to 77%, an 11% drop. Always look at what Labor does, not what they say they will do. Mr Speaker, the health of all Australians, particularly given our ageing society, is always a priority for the Coalition. Last year I committed to an investment in best practice for women's health issues, including endometriosis. Tonight I welcome the government's commitment of $50 million in this budget for longer consultations for endometriosis and pelvic pain. The Coalition will continue to support measures for women's health, particularly in primary care settings. More needs to be done to support women's health, including for menopause and perimenopause. We will continue to develop and support good policy to this end. We'll work with the RACGP, AMA and other stakeholders who want to see more support for women in our community. Concerningly, Australia is facing a looming shortage of GPs, some 11,000 by 2031. We need more GPs, especially in our suburbs and in our regional areas. Junior doctors who enter general practice earn about 3/4 of the salary of their counterparts in hospitals. Working with the Royal Australian College of General Practitioners and the Australian Medical Association, a coalition government will invest $400 million to provide junior doctors who train in general practice with incentive payments, assistance with leave entitlements and support for pre-vocational training. We'll also make sure that we support better outcomes for Indigenous Australians through the health system. Led by Senators Little and Ambajimpa Price, we will provide practical solutions to improve education, health and safety outcomes for Indigenous women and children, especially in our most disadvantaged remote communities. Yeah. Mr Speaker, in recent times, under this government, our nation has been rocked by many shocking and tragic events. The stabbings at Bondi were truly horrific, where 6 people were murdered. Knife attacks on a bishop in Western Sydney and a man in Perth radicalised by radicalised youth. Incidents reinforcing the enduring threat of extreme Islamism. 28 women killed in violent circumstances this year alone. More than 150 hardcore criminals, including murderers and sex offenders, released from immigration detention into the community by the Albanese government, with some already having reoffended. And since Hamas's barbaric terrorist attack on Israel, a 700% increase in anti-Semitic incidents on our soil. Australians are unsettled by crime on our streets, ruptures to our social cohesion and threats to our national security. The coalition government will provide much-needed leadership in tackling knife crime. We will work with states and territories to develop uniform knife laws across all jurisdictions, laws which will give police the powers to stop and search using detector wands like Queensland's Jack's Law, and laws which will limit and restrict the sale and possession of knives to minors and dangerous individuals. Yeah. Mr Speaker, as a former police officer, the horrific scenes of beaten women and distraught children I encountered stay with me to this day, as do the memories of taking women who were shaking with fear to shelters and safe homes and helping them relocate with their children to safety. And it's why I've dedicated much of my career to protecting women and children. It's why, as Home Affairs Minister, I established the $70 million Australian Centre to Counter Child Exploitation and recommit to doubling its size. Recently, Molly Ticehurst, a 28-year-old mother from New South Wales, was murdered because her violent ex-partner was on bail. Our bail laws need to be tightened in this country, and under a coalition government that I lead, they will be tightened. Offences relating to partner and family violence generally fall under state and territory legislation, but there is also a role for the Commonwealth to play. A coalition government will make it an offence to use mobile phones and computer networks to cause an intimate partner or family member fear for their personal safety, to track them using spyware or to engage in coercive behaviours. Yeah. We will toughen the bail laws and apply to these new Commonwealth offences. Mr Speaker, I've been a Minister for Immigration and Home Affairs. They are demanding but rewarding jobs. I granted thousands of visas to sick children, to parents with medical conditions, to victims of sexual assault and refugees who have gone on to become wonderful Australians. The public rarely hears about that side of the job. But in those roles, you also need to make tough decisions. I cancelled more than 6,300 visas of dangerous non-citizen criminals, with a priority on those committing sexual offences against women and children, driven by my desire to make sure that they don't harm any further Australians. If a minister doesn't have the backbone to do that, they're letting our country and our citizens down. Yeah. I made our country and our citizens safer, and as Prime Minister, I will do it again. Yeah. Mr Speaker, it will take a coalition government once again to stop the people smugglers and to deport criminals. It will also take a coalition government to turn the tide of anti-Semitism afflicting our country. Anti-Semitism is not just a threat to one segment of our community. It's a threat to our social cohesion and to our democratic values. Some of the most strident anti-Semitic standard bearers have come from our university campuses. We will also provide the moral and political leadership which makes it abundantly clear that we expect the law to be enforced readily, not reluctantly, against those inciting hatred and violence. Mr Speaker, tackling crime in our community also means doing the same online. There's been an uptick in young Australians committing filming and uploading. There's been an uptick in young Australians committing crimes where they're filming and uploading their crimes to social media. The Coalition Government will make it an offence to post criminal acts online. Those convicted will be banned from using digital platforms and liable for up to 2 years imprisonment. As a father of 3 children who all grew up in the digital age, I'm troubled by the material our children are exposed to. And that's why I announced in my budget reply last year that a Coalition Government will ban gambling advertising during the broadcasting of sporting games. However, I'm more worried by the criminal dark underbelly of the internet. At the fingertips of our children is a concerning volume of sexually explicit and violent material, as well as content designed to indoctrinate. We welcome the government's belated decision to back our policy for an age verification trial. But unlike Labor, a coalition government will include social platforms like Instagram and TikTok in such a trial. Mr Speaker, authoritarian regimes like China, Russia, Iran and North Korea are emboldened. They're expanding their militaries, they're conducting cyber attacks and engaging in foreign interference. The Prime Minister and his deputy rightly say that we're living in the most precarious period since the Second World War, a view echoed by our intelligence agencies and our allies. Strenuous efforts are needed to maintain peace and to deter acts of aggression, like those recently aimed at our Navy and Air Force. The 1930s taught us nothing else. It was that appeasement and weakness of leadership do not end well. In this critical period of risk, I will offer our country strong leadership backed by significant investment into the Defence Forces. Labor's priorities are clearly wrong and, frankly, dangerous. The government has announced an additional 36,000 public servants in this budget, costing Australian taxpayers $24 billion over 4 years. The Coalition sees areas like defence as much more a priority than office staff in Canberra, given the precarious times in which we live and threats in our region. We will reprioritise Canberra-centric funding and make an additional investment into defence to rapidly enhance the capability of our men and women in uniform. We're working with leaders in defence industry to identify projects and investments that can be made in Australia to keep us safe in an uncertain world. Mr Speaker, I want to say to every Australian tonight that my vision is to get our country back on track, to make your life easier, to make us safe and secure again. The job of the Prime Minister is to be strong, not weak, to be fair and firm, to be compassionate and definite, to unite, not divide, especially through referendums. As each day passes, this government increasingly shows how disconnected it is from the views, the values and the vision of everyday Australians. Labor has forgotten the main principle of governing. It isn't the people who serve the will of the government. It is the government who serves the will of the people. I came to this parliament having served my community as a police officer and as a successful small business owner employing 40 people. I've had the honour of serving Australians on the front bench since 2004 in many portfolios under 4 Prime Ministers. My team and I have the experience to get our country back on track and to support everyday Australians. We live in the greatest country in the world. But at the moment, Australia and Australians are being held back. Australians are being left behind and they feel it. They're being left behind by this weak Labor government who has the wrong priorities. And our country deserves so much more. Ask yourself this question. Are you better off today than you were 2 years ago? Do you feel safer or more secure than you did 2 years ago? When governments change, the country changes. Australians can't afford another 3 years of the Albanese Labor government. At the next election, it will be a time for change, a better change for you, for your family and for our country. Thank you very much, Mr Speaker.
Welcome back. That was the opposition leader Peter Dutton giving his reply to the Albanese government's third budget. The opposition leader will join me shortly in the studio, but first let's bring in Chief Political Correspondent Laura Tingle. For days, for weeks, people have been saying it's time for us to see some meat on the bone, some detail of what the opposition's policies are going to look like. So what have we just seen?
Not very much, Sarah. Obviously, he's focused on some really hot-button issues: housing, migration and energy. I think it's very interesting in terms of the way this energy debate is going to play out in the lead up to the election, that he kept on talking about Labor's renewables-only policy, which I think backs in the assessment last week that we discussed that Labor felt vulnerable on this point and moved to that future gas policy. But nuclear, it's supposed to be the answer. We still don't know anything about what Peter Dutton's going to do to implement this. He's also calling all sorts of people in to say that they support it, including John Howard, who actually moved an amendment back in government to stop the development of other nuclear reactors other than Lucas Heights. So the argument there's a little bit weak. And there are also questions about his claims that renewables have driven up energy prices. The energy market operator itself actually said at the beginning of the year that renewables had driven down the prices. It was actually other developments about export gas which had led to energy prices going up. So the energy stuff, we still don't know very much. Housing and migration. The government, of course, has also talked about cutting migration numbers to ease housing. A couple of things here. One of them is that the majority of our migration, of course, is not controlled. It's temporary migration, a development that once again happened under the coalition. You can't cut that back very easily unless you put in caps on temporary migrant visas. There's been no talk of that from Peter Dutton. And there is another issue, which is if he's saying he wants to deal with inflation, there are limits, and this is the same problem the government had. If you cut back temporary migration and the number of students who can fill all those jobs we need, that actually increases wages, which is great for people who are earning wages, but actually is an inflationary pressure. So there's a delicate balance to be held there. So I think that's another issue. We don't have costings on any of these various policies. The super for housing is an existing policy. It's not worked particularly effectively in other places like New Zealand. So that's a problem. And I thought the other thing that was interesting was that given the law and order stance that Peter Dutton has, and which is very much part of his DNA, I was surprised he wasn't talking about more on helping domestic violence victims, because that was a real shortcoming in the budget. For example, improving the amount of funding for legal services, improving frontline services. Talking about the bail laws is fine, but as he admitted in his speech, bail laws primarily affect things under the control of states and territories, not the federal government.
So just come back to the politics before we look at some of those items in detail. Were you expecting more from him, and what is it that he's using this speech to do? Because clearly it wasn't to start laying out a whole list of new things they're going to do. So is this setting a tone or a subject that's going to characterise their politics for the months ahead?
I think it is setting a tone which is very much, it's just very slogan-driven, and you've got the same sort of very literal slogans on the other side now. It's basically sort of appealing to all of those real sort of white-hot, very simple ideas of we can't get enough houses, it's all migration's fault. I think that sort of sets us up for some pretty ugly politics, which doesn't require much rational, detailed policy. It's really appealing to people's, sort of anger about things, and I think it's not going to sort of be an attractive argument to have, because it's sort of really escalating that sense that it's all migrants' fault. Now, in fact, he's talking about putting limits on housing being bought by foreigners.
Yes, 2 years, yes.
Yeah, but I'd just like to point out that the number of residential real estate in 2021-22 that was purchased with some level of foreign ownership was only 4,000 houses, and only 1,300 of those were established dwellings. So it's not that foreigners are buying houses. I mean, yes, students coming in need somewhere to live, but we have to actually look at how some of these things work.
Let's just come back to one of the basic topics of the Albanese government's budget, which is, of course, framing it in terms of it being about inflation. He said any further interest rate rises will rest firmly on the shoulders of the PM and the Treasurer. That's clearly true. I mean, how pivotal politically is this inflation question now?
Look, I think it is pivotal, and as we discussed the other night, I think, once again, it's the Reserve Bank that people are looking to for the sort of endorsement, things are going to be getting better. Now, there was some good news today in terms of the labour market numbers, which showed that the unemployment rate's gone up, which isn't good, but that's partly because more people are still looking for work. So that has been seen by the financial markets as ruling out the possibility of any chance of rates rising this year,
yes.
which is a start.
Yes.
So I think it really rests with this question of whether there's enough sort of persuasion, not just in that mechanical change in the CPI rate, but in the sense that inflation isn't being pushed to really sort of give the governor and the bank the confidence to start cutting rates at the end of the year. And so all the talk about early elections really just relies on what happens there.
So they still have a little needle. They still have the opportunity to thread the needle. But just to come back to how he's presenting himself, and it actually made me think about the fact, as you said yesterday at the press club speech with the Treasurer, you've done, 40 budgets? So you've done plenty elections. Is it an unreasonable expectation at this point in the cycle, with this budget in reply, that the opposition leader should be putting out his wares?
Look, it's varied. I think the now Prime Minister wasn't exactly detailed about his policies either. So it's not sort of an absolute cardinal sin that he has not put out more. But nuclear policy. Look, it sounds fine if you think that it's going to reduce your household prices. But if you're also talking about a situation where you've got to have to put these nuclear reactors in somewhere, you've got to describe to people how that's going to happen. That's a really big ask to be sort of, to be not giving any details of that yet.
Yes, I mean, we did expect those details to be coming a few weeks ago.
Yes, he said he was going to do it before now, so
yes.
He'll be under pressure to explain that.
And were we anticipating something on tax reform, or at least the beginnings of a conversation about tax?
Well, I suppose I wasn't.
Just not realistic. No. OK, finishing on tax, nothing to see there. Laura, thank you very much. Let's continue with the opposition leader's budget and reply speech. So the opposition leader is now just a few minutes away, but first here's some of the responses to Tuesday's budget.
A $300 energy bill credit for every household headlines the cost of living help in the budget.
They're taxpayers and they'll get a tax cut, and they're householders, so they'll get an energy bill relief.
They're promising this so-called relief, and they're putting a Band-Aid on a bullet wound.
It also required a series of balanced judgments, hard heads making sure that we are robust and rigorous, and warm hearts recognising that people are doing it tough.
I've been a bit mystified by the suggestions that this is a pre-election budget.
Were there any cigars last night?
There were not. There were a couple of Red Bulls consumed at one point, but no cigars.
Tonight's budget has something for everyone, but certainly not a lot for some.
To deny people, over 1 million people, on the very lowest incomes, the urgent and permanent increase in a low unemployment payment is a cruel denial.
The Coalition is signalling its early opposition to the Future Made in Australia Act to pump billions of dollars into industries like green hydrogen and critical minerals.
With respect, most people don't seem to remember budget and replies because they're usually pretty thin with policy ideas. You going to buck that trend?
I think we've done a bit of that in the last couple of budget reply speeches.
We do have to make sure that our housing policy and immigration policy are aligned. It's a real struggle now for so many Australians to rent a house, to buy a house.
Peter Dutton is to announce tonight a coalition policy of a massive immigration cut, setting up this election for a fight on net migration.
The Leader of the Opposition, Peter Dutton, joins me now, fresh from the chamber. Congratulations on your speech.
Thanks,
and
Sarah.
welcome to Back to 7:30.
Thank you.
I want to start with immigration. Sky called it massive. What you have announced is a 25% cut to Australia's migration intake. Where in the system will those cuts be?
Well, there are a number of parts, obviously, that make up the problem that the government's created at the moment. It's obviously been a huge influx of international students. The numbers have gone up in the programs otherwise, including the refugee and humanitarian program, as well as the permanent migration program. So our proposal is to reduce each of those and to make sure that we can release housing stock, existing houses that are there already, for which there is huge demand from Australians either to rent or to purchase, and to put Australians first in terms of home ownership. And that's a very key part of the speech.
Australia first doesn't sound like a very Australian type thing to say.
Well, there are countless families I've spoken to as I've gone around the country.
I think it's the tone I'm talking about.
Well, of every nationality, of people who have just arrived, people who are second, third generation from India or China. They can't find a house for their child who's in the workforce, working hard, paying taxes, but cannot for love nor money buy a house.
No question, we've got a housing shortage.
So it's for all of those Australians
yes.
Who want to find a house.
Let me just go back to the question. So whereabouts in the system are those cuts in those numbers going to come from?
Well again, so to the permanent program, we reduced that to...
Yes, I beg your pardon. So within that program, are we going to see a cut to the skills program?
Well, we've said that we want to prioritise skills, particularly those with skills who can help build houses and help in the construction sector, because we have an 11-year low in building approvals at the moment, and the homes the Prime Minister's promising just aren't going to be built. And anybody knows at the moment, I mean, it's near impossible to get a builder or a carpenter or an electrician to build a new house or to do a renovation.
So in that
critical,
so
we need to be realistic about that.
In that critical skills area, to be clear, there's not going to be any cuts to migration of people doing critical skills visas.
There are a couple of points here, and I understand the point you're getting to. One is...
I mean, to underline it for the audience's sake, obviously we know there are huge, I think it's 48% of professional occupations showing skill shortages. So I want to be very clear about that. Yeah. Will there be any cuts to that part of the program?
Well, there'll be a cut to the overall program, and the mix we've had always in government and that we've held to in opposition is that you want about a 2/3, 1/3 split. That's how it was in the Howard years, in the Rudd-Gillard years, and since then, and that's what we would continue to go on.
That does mean cutting some people's opportunities to come here in the critical skills section.
It means that we can take a decision to bring more people in, which the Prime Minister's done in the last 2 years, almost 1 million people, when only 265,000 homes are built. So we can pretend that the housing can appear overnight, but it can't.
But this is a question about a critical skill shortage that exists in Australia. As I said, 48% of professional occupations in national shortage. I just want to be absolutely clear whether or not in those categories, nurses, doctors, cybersecurity experts, for example, we're not going to see further shortages.
We prioritise the skills list. I mean, that's an important observation. But I guess the point that I was building to otherwise is that we want to make sure that those people who may have recently retired, who won't come back into the workforce on a part-time basis because it affects their pension with the taper rate, that we've allowed in our announcement tonight for more of those people to come back in. Now, we have 15 million people in Australia of working age with many and varied skills, and many who want to come back into the workforce part-time. If it's beyond the wit of big business in this country to train them up or to provide opportunity for them to fill some of those skills that you're talking about, then I think we've got bigger problems than we realise. So the onus
but we're talking about people overseas. We're talking about, I understand that that's a training question. That's a question about training, but obviously there's a lag. In this case, we're talking about industries that need a trained workforce right now.
But I mean, listen to the point you're making, which doesn't make any sense. You've got nurses who have just retired. You've got people in the trades.
But you were talking about training.
You're talking about trades. No, I was talking about people who had retired and people who are veterans, and allowing them to work more
These are people with the requisite skills who can come back into the workforce but refuse to now because they ultimately lose their pension, their healthcare card, etc. So we liberate that workforce, and those people obviously already have, in most cases, the vast majority of cases, existing housing arrangements. So that makes sense. But in the end, you have to make tough decisions, you're right.
Yes.
And my decision is to prioritise Australians for housing in our country because we've got people living in tents, we've got people living in cars. I want to see them in housing.
No question that there is a housing crisis in this country. Let me just talk briefly to you about international students because you are talking about restricting those numbers. Now, we know that international students pay for a very large percentage of university research. Will you commit now, if you're going to cap their numbers, to replacing that funding in full?
Well, let's look at University of Sydney, for example. They made $1.4 billion last year out of international students, last year alone. 47% of their students on campus are international students, and it's untenable. And the other universities, frankly, have been critical, at least in private, of Sydney.
I mean, it's worth pointing out that the NAB last year said that international students also accounted for more than half of all of Australia's economic growth. They're a very important cohort for Australian growth and productivity, aren't they?
Well, they're a part of it, but we need to house them. And you can't bring in a million people.
I think only 4%
houses.
of international students actually are in the rental market.
Really? Where are they living, Sarah?
I'm not an expert in, housing, but I'm
I'll tell you where
quoting
they're
figures
living. They're living in rental accommodation,
bodies that run,
which is evidenced by the fact that people are 40 and 50 deep at the moment, lining up for a rental property that they can't get into. 49 people miss out in that equation.
So when the Real Estate Institute quotes those
sure.
figures, are they wrong that only 4% of international students are in the private rental market?
Well, I just say to you, why do we have a housing crisis in this country?
For many complex reasons, mostly to do with supply. But let's just stay with this issue for a moment. I just want to go back to the question that I asked you.
No, I actually just want to pick you up on that point because you're in error. The government has brought in 928,000 people in 2 years. There are 265,000 homes that have been built in that period. Do you think there's a mismatch? Of course there is. So we can't pretend that there's not. I don't have any problem.
I'm merely pointing out the obvious that we know that this is a question of supply.
But the statement you make is factually incorrect. And all I'd say is that do we want international students? Fantastic, that's great, and they can contribute to the economy, but we need to have the planning in place before you bring people in, because otherwise they displace Australians from housing, which is exactly what's happened.
Now, what you're proposing here, the program will increase again after a 1 year cut to it. So I just want to acknowledge that.
2 years.
2 year, I beg your pardon. I'm just getting over the facts now. But thank you for the correction. Now, this, of course, isn't just about skills, and it's not just about international students, although those things are both very important. Long term, we are an ageing population. We need young migrants to fill the gap, to pay the taxes, to provide the services into as the population ages. Isn't there a danger here, if you look to migration to solve the problems, that we end up with a less productive economy, a smaller economy?
Well, we have a less productive economy if we've got people sleeping in tents and in cars. And homelessness is at a record high under this government. Young Australians have lost the dream of home ownership, and I intend to restore it. We've got pensioners who can't find rental accommodation, and that is not an acceptable situation morally, socially or economically for our country, and it's not one that I would abide as Prime Minister. Yes, we want to see a balanced migration program, but this government has ramped it up way beyond where Kevin Rudd and Julia Gillard had their programs. It has been unmanaged. Each prediction the government's made in my EFO or in budgets where they say that the migration numbers or the net overseas migration figure will come down, it always goes up. And so you need to plan, and it's not just housing. People know that if you move suburbs, it's hard to get your kids into school or into childcare. It's hard to get into a GP because the doctors have closed their books. It's hard to get elective surgery. These factors have all contributed to capacity constraints because of the lack of planning in the migration program. And there's no sense in denying that because that's just the lived reality of Australians every day.
Let's move on to some of the other points that you were making this evening. And one of them, crucially, is about spending and has been about spending for some time. You are critical of the government's budget and the amount of money that it adds to spending next year. Will you now detail what specific cuts you're going to do to rein in government spending?
Well, $13.7 billion is a good starting point, and that is money that's going to green hydrogen product producers and to billionaires and mining projects otherwise.
Well, let's just, since you've raised that, let's stay with Future in Australia, because what you've gone to is the centrepiece of the government's Future Made in Australia, and in particular the production credits for Australian businesses. Now, we're in a world of global competition, as you know, in these new industries. Why do you oppose these tax breaks that could help Australian businesses in this era of very sharp global competition?
Because I'm not into wasting taxpayers' money.
Why is it a waste?
Making sure that people who work hard for their money can believe and have faith in a government that they're not going to waste it. And I think you can have a look at the government's decision in relation to solar panels.
But I'm asking you, why don't we say...
No, this is all part of the same package.
Yeah, but I want to ask you about the production tax credits, because this is the centrepiece of the government's policy.
The centrepiece
That's what we're talking about.
No, it's not actually. The centrepiece of their measure, which they announced as a pre-budget announcement, was in relation to solar panels and quantum computing.
But I'm asking,
it's all part of the same
I understand,
spend.
but I'm asking you specifically, and I think it's fair enough. You've come here as the Leader of the Opposition. You're presenting yourself as the alternative Prime Minister. Yes. You are saying that you will not support these production tax credits for these new industries. And I'm asking, because of the enormous amount of money that's being made available in competitive countries, in competitive industries, why won't you help Australian businesses be competitive?
Well, a couple of points. One is that Australian business is not going to be competitive in the production of solar panels against China.
I think these production tax credits relate to critical minerals and green hydrogen.
When you say that you've asked when you say that you've asked
I'm just asking you to answer that question
and answer
first.
The questions, that's the opportunity that you've offered me, and I'm very happy to take it up.
Indeed, and you've pivoted to solar panels.
I just need to be able to finish a sentence.
Yes, let's go back to production credits.
Where are they spending money? On solar panels. It's not going to work, and it will be a waste of taxpayers' money. I'd love to think it's going to work. It's not. I'd love to think that there's not demand for different products or that others might out in the economy. The government can conjure up all sorts of different arguments and figures. We've just got to deal with the reality. The reality is at the moment there's huge demand for our critical minerals. The reality at the moment is that there is huge demand for our mining product, and if that demand is there is an enormous amount of capital that's available to support those startup projects.
And those projects are receiving huge amounts of money from, for example, the United States Inflation Reduction Act, which is what is making our own mining companies potentially not competitive.
Just to finish the sentence, though. So if there's demand for those products, that is, there's an order book that at the moment...
well, the order book doesn't exist yet, because these are production credits for
it does actually.
Production that will get to scale.
But again, Sarah, please, if we could just stick with the facts, there's enormous demand and order books for all sorts of critical minerals at the moment. The demand exists, which is why these projects want to get off the ground. Now, there's an enormous amount of capital out there in super funds, in individuals, in institutions who are investing into companies.
Well, let me ask you this question. West Australian. Here's a question. I don't want to run out of time on this, because you've got the Leader of the West Australian Liberals supports the tax credits. She says she said that today. Have you asked her to stop undermining your argument?
So I'll just finish the sentence that I was trying to finish before. There's an enormous amount of capital out there for these projects. Why would you put at risk taxpayers' money into these projects when the private sector is prepared to fund them? That is a fundamental question to ask. Now, I want to see WA boom, and under my government, they will. I'm not going to go forward with the nature positive, which is really the mining negative bill that Tanya Plibersek has shelved for the time being, because the West Australian Premier monstered the Labor government here and they retreated. That would be a disaster for mining in WA. It would see it come to a halt. That will not happen under a government I lead. We will not have in place all the regulation and the burdens that take tens of years for mines to be developed, because if we get mining right and we can meet this insatiable demand for our critical minerals, we can grow the WA economy and therefore the Australian economy. We can see roads and the GPs and the NDIS, the other services funded. We can put money into defence, which is required. At the moment, the government is talking out of both sides of their mouth when it comes to the mining sector. That's not something we...
Let's go back to spending, because that's where we were before we went on to the Future Made in Australia. I was asking you what specific cuts that you are proposing to make to reverse the spending, the government spending of which you're so critical.
Sure.
It's time for some detail. What are you prepared to cut?
Well, I was about to go there, and I think you cut me off again before, but let me finish it. The government's employed 36,000 more public servants in Canberra at a cost of $24 billion over 4 years. The entire Defence Force is made up of 58,000 men and women.
I think I just want to interrupt to say this. You're talking about, well, I think it's important. This is not a matter of interruption, it's a matter of staying on topic.
Right.
What we're talking about is you wanting to reverse this year's surplus, goes into deficit next year. We're talking about $37 billion. Public servants aren't going to fix that, so I'm asking which parts of government spending, substantial cuts to government spending, because you're also talking about adding the top end of the stage 3 tax cuts back. These are large sums of money, $39 billion for that. What are you going to do to provide the money that's going to reverse this deficit of which you are so critical?
The $13.7 billion and the $24 billion that I've just identified, almost $40 billion. Which opposition leader has come in here and detailed $40 billion worth of spending cuts? None ever. And this government has spent $315 billion more than what we had budgeted when we were in government. It means that the average family now is paying a much higher interest rate. It means that people can't get into houses because of their decisions that they've made in the budget. And I want to turn that around. I want to make sure that we can get our country back on track. And you've got a government at the moment that is prioritising public servants in Canberra above our Defence Force, above support for pensioners, above people who are living homelessly, above people who can't get in to see a GP. I want to listen to and act on the advice of the Australian people. That's what I've detailed tonight. We'll do it in a responsible, not reckless way, and we can provide a much greater vision and future for our country if we do that.
Peter Dutton, thank you very much indeed for coming up
Great
straight
pleasure,
after the
Sarah.
speech. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.